Hi. It's Puppy. It's also Friday. Friday the 20th. Which means we're getting real close to Lunar New Year. Which is on Sunday. Oh, fine, Puppy. He's very upset that he has not had a snack yet from me. So I'm gonna be doing some lion dancing this weekend. That'll be fun. Did a little bit of practice during the week. I don't know all of the sort of rules surrounding Lunar New Year, but I've picked up a few through Kung Fu school. Like, tomorrow, Saturday, New Year's Eve, you're not supposed to eat beef. I think chicken and fish are okay. I don't know if you're supposed to eat beef or pork. I know specifically you're not supposed to eat beef. And you're not supposed to clean. That includes like cleaning your house. Hi, hi. Sharkies, how's it going? I'm just talking about some of the rules about Lunar New Year that you're supposed to follow if you want good luck for the next year. No beef tomorrow. From midnight tonight, you're not supposed to eat beef. I think on Sunday, I think it's okay. Like Sunday afternoon. You're not supposed to clean starting tomorrow. You're not supposed to clean your house. You're not supposed to wash your hair. You're not supposed to sweep. And that is until like mid next week. It's not lucky. Yes, red is good. Um, yeah, what else? I know, like, at my Kung Fu school, we'll do, like, an offering. So there's a table set up right now already with, like, paper money and some fruit and some chocolates. Some pomelos. Is that how that's pronounced? Which are sort of like a grapefruit. I think they're related to grapefruit. Well, okay, now we bought one once, and I was like shocked at how light it was. It was all peel and pith, and it was like really, really light. For something so big, it was very lightweight. But that might have just been not a good pomelo, as it turns out, because the ones at the school are quite a bit heavier, and I'm told that, yeah, you want to buy heavier ones. So I might have just bought a really light pomelo. um, yeah, so we're going to be doing some line dances at a few places. I originally thought we were going to be doing two on this weekend, but now it turns out we might be doing two each day, so two on Saturday and two on Sunday. we're definitely doing Coquitlam Center at noon on Saturday. And then after that, we might be going and doing a quick one at like a senior's home or something, just like in a lobby. And then on Sunday, we might be doing like a farmer's market in the morning, depending on whether or not they get back to us. And then in the afternoon, I think it's at like 5 o'clock or something, we're doing Hard Rock Casino. And then actually we might go back and do one at our actual Kung Fu school, just as a, luck for the school for the year. So there might actually be, counting that, 3 on Sunday. So I'm going to be tired after all that's done. It was, I don't know, apparently my Sifu was having some trouble communicating with this person from the farmer's market that was organizing it, who was just not replying. That would be good. Yeah, so I'm going to have a somewhat busy weekend. And Sharkies are going to try again at your Christmas dinner? I'm going to try and come. That would be cool. Yeah. I would say, I doubt we'll be starting right at noon. I would imagine it'll probably be it might be between 12 to 12:15. I doubt it'll be, I believe that's supposed to be our starting time, though, is at noon. But I don't know how much of that's going to be used for setup first. But yeah, it'll be fun. There'll be drumming and dancing. The last time, because I'm pretty sure we did, we've done Coquitlam Center at least once. I've done it once before. I don't know how many times the school's done it, but, and yeah, we drew a bit of a crowd then. So that was fun. I'm wondering, because the last time we were there, we did sort of in a lobby area at Coquitlam Center, and then we went into the TNT market there because they wanted us to come through as well, and we went up and down some of the aisles or something like that. Or I think maybe we did we went around the store, and then they'd hung up some lettuce, which is part of sort of the lion dance, so we did some tricks with the lettuce. The last I had heard, we haven't been requested to go into TNT yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if it ended up happening. So that's, maybe, maybe not. But yeah, there'll be some dances and some tricks and stuff. It'll be good. So we are real close. Real easy bingo sitting and waiting there for us. All we need is some sarcasm from Silk, which is just gonna happen. You're having to do take 2 of having family over for Ukrainian Christmas. Which is sort of like a take 3 at this point, depending on how you count things. If for some reason, Silk vanishes and we just don't get that, I don't know what our next closest would be. So far, no plagues. That's good. Fingers crossed that continues. Because if we don't get this, then we're not going to get this. Right? If Silk's around, if this one's happening, almost certainly this one as well. So it's hard doing this mirrored. So this one is most likely going to happen first if we're going to get a bingo. But if for some reason that one doesn't go, then I guess this row is probably the most likely, maybe. Right? That's the next closest. anything else is, like, other than we've got the B column and then these two rows, and anything other than those I think is at least 3 spaces away. Yeah. Looks that way to me. So, on Wednesday, we read chapter 14. Getting settled back there. During which we had Princess Ce'Nedra's 16th birthday. Wasn't much of a celebration other than the betrothal ceremony. We also had Sadi from Nyssa arrive and have a bit of a conversation with Garion, update him on how things have been going in Nyssa. Sounds like they've been working out all right. There were some gifts. Some acorns arrived from the Dryads. And then Princess Ce'Nedra gave Garion a ring that had belonged to one of the first emperors of Tol'Nedra. In exchange, he gave her the amulet that had belonged to Aunt Pol's sister, Poledra, which seemed like a very nice present until it turned out that it could not be removed. As a nice little surprise from Polgara and Belgarath that they chose not to tell anyone about ahead of time for some reason. So yeah, everybody was real happy about that, including all of us. And of course, where we left off, Ce'Nedra was blaming Garion because he's the one that gave it to her, so, like, makes sense. But, boy. So anyways, that's most of what happened. It wasn't actually the longest chapter. So why don't we get to chapter 15, if everybody's ready. In my copy, we are on page 138. We had discovered that we were more than halfway through Castle of Wizardry. Again, it's kind of hard to keep track in this particular copy, but it looks like it goes to page 246, and we're currently on 138. So here we go. Chapter 15. You're on 208 out of 373. Alright, yep. Similar. I think not quite 2/3 of the way through yet. Doing, mental approximations. Here we go. Garion was in a sour mood. Strong start to the chapter. Strong first sentence. Garion was in a sour mood. The prospect of another day of ceremony and tedious conferences was totally unbearable, and he had risen early to escape from the royal bedchamber before the insufferably polite appointment secretary with his endless lists could arrive to nail down the entire day. Garion privately detested the inoffensive fellow, even though he knew the man was only doing his job. A king's time had to be organized and scheduled, and it was the appointment secretary's task to take care of that. And so, each morning after breakfast, there came that respectful tapping at the door, and the appointment secretary would enter, bow, and then proceed to arrange the young king's day, minute by minute. Garion was morbidly convinced that somewhere, probably hidden away and closely guarded, was the ultimate master list that laid out the schedule for the rest of his life, including his royal funeral. But this day dawned too gloriously for thoughts of stuffy formality and heavy conference. Angst. Kind of ironic angst. The sun had come boiling up out of the sea of the winds, touching the snowfields atop the craggy peaks with a blushing pink, and the morning shadows in the deep valleys above the city were a misty blue. Organizational angst. The smell of spring pushed urgently in from the little garden outside his window, and Garion knew he must escape, if only for an hour or so. He dressed quickly in tunic, hose, and soft raven boots, rather carefully selecting clothes as unroyal as his wardrobe offered, which is probably still pretty high class. Garion's gone up in the world. Pausing only long enough to belt on his sword, he crept out of the royal apartments. He even considered not taking along his guards, but prudently decided against that. They were at a standstill in the search for the man who had tried to kill him in that dim hallway, but both Leldoran and Garion had discovered that the outer garments of any number of Revens needed repair. The grey cloak was not a ceremonial garment, but rather was something thrown on for warmth. It was a sturdy utilitarian covering, and quite a number of such robes had been allowed to fall into a condition of shocking disrepair. Moreover, now that spring was here, men would soon stop wearing them, and the only clue to the attacker's identity would be locked away in a closet somewhere. Garion brooded about that as he wandered moodily through the silent corridors of the citadel, with 2 mailed guards following at a respectful distance. The attempt, he reasoned, had not come from a Grolim. Aunt Pole's peculiar ability to recognize the mind of a Grolim would have alerted her instantly. In all probability, the attacker had not been a foreigner of any kind. There were too few foreigners on the island to make that very likely. It had to be a Revan. But why would a Revan want to kill the king who had just returned after 1,300 years? He sighed with perplexity over the problem, and let his mind drift off to other matters. He wished that he were only Garion again. He wished that more than anything. He wished that it might be possible for him to awaken in some out-of-the-way inn somewhere, and start out in the silver light of daybreak to ride alone to the top of the next hill to see what lay beyond. He sighed again. Garion's become an adventurer at heart. He was a public person now, and such freedom was denied him. He was coldly certain that he was never going to have a moment to himself again. As he passed an open doorway, he heard a familiar voice. "Sin creeps into our minds." The first word is sin. Everybody knows who this is. "Sin creeps into our minds the moment we let our thoughts stray," Relg was saying. Garion stopped, motioning his guards to silence. I'm just gonna do it right now. He's got a full troop of guards with him and he's eavesdropping. I don't even care how this scene turns out. That counts. Not only is he eavesdropping, but he's forcing others to eavesdrop with him. Alright, let's see. Must everything be a sin? Taiba asked. Alright, we're looking here for either causing Relg to go pray or don't touch me. Right, Bin? Must everything be a sin? Taiba asked. Inevitably, they were together. They had been together almost continually from the moment Relg had rescued Taiba from her living entombment in the cave beneath Rak-Thol. Garion was almost certain that neither of them was actually conscious of that fact. Moreover, he had seen evidence of discomfort, not only on Taiba's face, but on Relg's as well, whenever they were apart. Something beyond the control of either of them drew them together.
The world is filled with sin, Relg declared. We must guard against it constantly. We must stand jealous guard over our purity against all forms of temptation.
That would be very tiresome. Taiba sounded faintly amused.
I thought you wanted instruction, Relg accused her. If you just came here to mock me, I'll leave right now.
To go pray, Relg? You'll leave to go pray? Oh, sit down, Relg, she told him. We'll never get anywhere with this if you take offense at everything I say.
Have you no idea at all about the meaning of religion?
He asked after a moment. He actually sounded curious about it. In the slave pens, the word religion meant death. It meant having your heart cut out.
That was a Grolim perversion. Blech. Didn't you have a religion of your own?
The slaves came from all over the world, and they prayed to many gods, usually for death.
What about your own people? Who's your god?
I was told that his name is... Oh, so it is confirmed. I think we had confirmation before. That his name is Mara. We don't pray to him, though. Not since he abandoned us.
It is not man's place to accuse the gods, Relg told her sternly. Man's duty is to glorify his god and pray to him, even if the prayers aren't answered.
And what about the god's duty to man? She asked pointedly. Can a god not be negligent as well as a man? Wouldn't you consider a god negligent if he allowed his children to be enslaved and butchered, or if he allowed his daughters to be given as a reward to other slaves when they pleased their masters, as I was? Relg struggled with that painful question. I think you've led a very sheltered life, Relg, she told the zealot. I think you have a very limited idea of human suffering, of the kinds of things men can do to other men and women, apparently with the full permission of the gods.
You should have killed yourself,
he said stubbornly. Oy, this guy. Whatever for?
to avoid corruption, naturally.
You are an innocent, aren't you? I didn't kill myself because I wasn't ready to die. Even in the slave pens, life can be sweet, Relg, and death is bitter. What you call corruption is only a small thing, and not even always unpleasant. Blah.
Sinful woman,
He gasped. You worry too much about that, Relg, she advised him. Cruelty is a sin. Lack of compassion is a sin. But that other little thing, I hardly think so. I begin to wonder about you. Could it be that this Ul of yours is not quite so stern and unforgiving as you seem to believe? Does he really want all these prayers and rituals and grovelings? Or are they your way to hide from your God? Do you think that praying in a loud voice and pounding your head on the ground will keep him from seeing into your heart? Relg was making strangled noises. If our gods really loved us, they'd want our lives filled with joy, she continued relentlessly. But you hate joy for some reason. Probably because you're afraid of it. Joy is not sin, Relg. Joy is a kind of love, and I think the gods approve of it, even if you don't.
you're hopelessly depraved.
Perhaps so, she admitted casually. But at least I look life right in the face. I'm not afraid of it, and I don't try to hide from it.
Why are you doing this?
He demanded of her in an almost tragic voice.
Why must you forever follow me and mock me with your eyes?
I don't really know, she replied, sounding almost puzzled. You're not really that attractive. Since we left Rakthol, I've seen dozens of men who interested me much more. At first it was because I knew that I made you nervous, and because you were afraid of me. I rather enjoyed that, but lately there's more to it than that. It doesn't make any sense, of course. You're what you are, and I'm what I am. But for some reason I want to be with you. She paused. Tell me, Relg, and don't try to lie about it. Would you really want me to go away and never see you again? There was a long and painful silence.
May Ul forgive me,
Relg groaned finally. I'm sure he will, Relg, she assured him gently. Not entirely certain if that counts. That wasn't quite a prayer. But based on that conversation, it might be as close as we're going to get for the rest of the series. Garion moved quietly on down the corridor away from the open door. Something he had not understood before had begun to become quite clear. You're doing this, aren't you? He asked silently. Naturally, the dry voice in his mind replied. But why those two? Because it's necessary, Belgarian. I don't do things out of whim. We are all compelled by necessity, even I. Actually, what's going on between Relg and Taiba doesn't remotely concern you. Garion was a little stung by that. I thought, well, You assumed that you were my only care, that you were the absolute center of the universe. You're not, of course. There are other things almost equally important, and Relg and Taiba are centrally involved in one of those things. Your participation in that particular matter is peripheral at the most. They're going to be desperately unhappy if you force them together, Garion accused. That doesn't matter in the slightest. Their being together is necessary. You're wrong, though. It'll take them a while to get used to it, but once they do, they're both going to be very happy. Obedience to necessity does have its rewards, after all. Garion struggled with that idea for a while, then finally gave up. His own problems intruded once more on his thoughts. Inevitably, as he always did when he was troubled, he went looking for Aunt Pole. He found her sitting before the cozy fire in her apartment, sipping a cup of fragrant tea and watching through the window as the rosy morning sunlight set the snowfields above the city ablaze. "You're up early," she observed as he entered. "I wanted to talk to you," he told her, "and the only way I ever get the chance to do what I want is to leave my room before the man with my schedule for the day shows up." He flung himself into a chair. "They never give me a minute to myself." "You're an important person now, dear." "That wasn't my idea." He stared moodily out the window. "Grandfather's all right now, isn't he?" he asked suddenly. "What gave you that idea?" "Well, the other day when we gave Ce'Nedra the amulet, didn't he sort of—" "Most of that came from you, dear," she replied. "I felt something else. That could have been just me. It was a pretty subtle thing, and even I couldn't be sure if he had any part in it. There has to be some way we can find out. There's only one way, Garion, and that's for him to do something." "All right, let's go off with him someplace and have him try. Something sort of small, maybe?" "And how would we explain that to him?" "You mean he doesn't know?" Garion sat up quickly. "He might, but I rather doubt it." "You didn't tell him?" "Of course not. If he has any doubts whatsoever about his ability, he'll fail. And if he fails once, that'll be the end of it." "I don't understand." "A very important part of it is knowing that it's going to work. If you aren't absolutely sure, then it won't. That's why we can't tell him." I don't think she actually is. I get it sounding like that because he's like, "I thought I felt something." And she's like, "I don't know." It sounds unlikely, but she legitimately does not know if Belgarath has his power, and this is why, she hasn't talked to him about it, and she doesn't want to say, "Hey, do some magic," because she's worried about him doubting and failing. Garion thought about it. "I suppose that makes sense. But isn't it sort of dangerous? I mean, what if something really urgent comes up, and he tries to do something about it, and we all of a sudden find out that he can't? You and I would have to deal with it then, dear." "You seem awfully calm about it." Getting excited doesn't really help very much, Garion. The door burst open, and Queen Layla, her hair awry and her crown slipping precariously over one ear, stormed in. "I won't have it, Polgara," she declared angrily. "I absolutely won't have it. You've got to talk to him." "Oh, excuse me, Your Majesty," the plump little queen added, noticing Garion. "I didn't see you." She curtsied gracefully. "Your Highness," Garion replied, getting up hurriedly and bowing in return. "Who did you wish me to speak with, Layla?" Aunt Pole asked. "Anheg. He insists that my poor husband sit up and drink with him every night. Volrak's so sick this morning that he can barely lift his head off the pillow. That great bully of a Cherek is ruining my husband's health." "Anheg likes your husband, Layla. It's his way of showing his friendship." "Can't they be friends without drinking so much?" "I'll talk to him, dear," Aunt Pole promised. Mollified somewhat, Queen Layla departed, curtsying again to Garion. Garion was about to return to the subject of Belgarath's infirmity when Aunt Pole's maid came in to announce Lady Merrill. Barak's wife entered the room with a somber expression. "Your Majesty," she greeted Garion perfunctorily. Garion rose again to bow and politely respond. He was getting rather tired of it. "I need to talk with you, Polgara," Merrill declared. "Of course," Aunt Pole replied. "Would you excuse us, Garion?" "I'll wait in the next room," he offered. He crossed to the door, but did not close it all the way. Twice in one chapter, Garion. Once again, his curiosity overcame his good manners. Even the, neutral narrator is chastising Garion about his manners. That's how he likes to spend his mornings. You liking the story, Ben? No, I know. I heard them too. Don't worry about it. There's people talking outside. All the hot goss. "They all keep throwing it in my face," Merrill blurted almost before he was out of the room. "What's that?" "Well," Merrill hesitated, then spoke quite firmly. "My lord and I were not always on the best of terms," she admitted. "That's widely known, Merrill," Aunt Pole told her diplomatically. "That's the whole problem," Merrill complained. "They all keep laughing behind their hands and waiting for me to go back to being the way I was before." A note of steel crept into her voice. "Well, it's not going to happen," she declared, "so they can laugh all they want to." "I'm glad to hear that, Merrill," Aunt Pole replied. "Oh, Polgara," Merrill said with a helpless little laugh. "He looks so much like a great shaggy bear, but he's so gentle inside. Why couldn't I have seen that before? All those years wasted." "You had to grow up, Merrill," Aunt Pole told her. "It takes some people longer, that's all." I feel like... After Lady Merrill had left, Garion came back in and looked quizzically at Aunt Pole. "Has it always been like that?" he asked her. What I mean is, do people always come to you when they've got problems? I think it's a little of both. It sounds like it's. I'm not going to say that she is equally to blame with him at all. Not my opinion. But from what little information we have, it sounds like he wasn't great, and she responded in a negative way to that, and it kind of, I think they sort of fed off of each other's negativity. In some order of things. Do people always come to you when they've got problems? It happens now and then, she replied. People seem to think that I'm very wise. Usually they already know what they have to do, so I listen to them and agree with them and give them a bit of harmless support. It makes them very happy. I set aside a certain amount of time each morning for these visits. They know that I'm here if they feel the need for someone to talk to. Would you care for some tea? He shook his head. Her line there, the like, usually they already know what they have to do. It reminds me of the Oracle from The Matrix. Didn't she say something very similar? Like, I think when Neo was going to find out if he was the one, and she's saying, like I say, that's odd, or that's interesting, but you already know what I'm going to say, or something like that. She had that line, and I think there was something else. I don't know if there was more in the second movie. Anyways, I wonder if the Wachowskis? I wonder if they read these books. Probably not. Probably just a coincidence. It's not that unusual a line. Anyways, he shook his head. Isn't it an awful burden? All these other people's problems, I mean? It's not really that heavy, Garion, she answered. Their problems are usually rather small and domestic. It's rather pleasant to deal with things that aren't quite so earth-shaking. Besides, I don't mind visitors, whatever their reasons for coming. The next visitor, however, was Queen Islena, and her problem was more serious. Garion withdrew again when the maid announced that the Queen of Cherek wished to speak privately with the Lady Polgara. But, as before, 3 times. As before, his curiosity compelled him to listen at the door of the adjoining chamber. I've tried everything I can think of, Polgara, Islena declared, but Grodig won't let me go. The High Priest of Balar. These guys. I'll just retire to my snooping room. Would you mind if I installed a portrait, preferably with its eye holes cut out? The High Priest of Balar? He knows everything, naturally, Islena confirmed. All his underlings reported my every indiscretion to him. He threatens to tell Anheg if I try to sever my connection with the bear cult. How could I have been so stupid? He's got his hand around my throat. Just how indiscreet have you been, Islena? Aunt Pole asked the Queen pointedly. I went to some of their rituals, Islena confessed. I put a few cult members in positions in the palace. I passed some information along to Grodeg. Which rituals, Islena? Not those, Polgara, Islena replied in a shocked voice. I'd never stoop to that. What are those rituals? So all you really did was attend a few harmless gatherings where people dress up in bearskins and let a few cultists into the palace, where there was probably a dozen or more already anyway, and pass on a bit of harmless palace gossip. It was harmless, wasn't it? I didn't pass on any state secrets, Polgara, if that's what you mean, the Queen said stiffly. Then Grodeg doesn't really have any hold over you, Islena. What should I do, Polgara? The Queen asked in an anguished voice. Go to Anheg. Tell him everything. I can't. You must. Otherwise, Grodeg will force you into something worse. Actually, the situation could be turned to Anheg's advantage. Tell me exactly how much you know about what the cult's doing. They've begun creating chapters among the peasants, for one thing. They've never done that before, Aunt Paul mused. The cult's always been restricted to the nobility and the priesthood. I can't be sure, Islena told her, but I think they're preparing for something major, some kind of confrontation. I'll mention it to my father, Aunt Paul replied. I think he'll want to take steps. As long as the cult was the plaything of the priesthood and the minor nobility, it wasn't really all that important. But rousing the peasantry is quite another thing. Hey, it's Bear! How's it going? Congratulations on your 1-year anniversary you had recently. We are reading more of the Belgariad. We're on Castle of Wizardry. I like how Polgara... Oh, hi, puppy. I like how Polgara here is like, the minor nobility, the priesthood, they don't really matter. The peasants, though, that could be dangerous. I've heard a few other things as well, Islena continued. I think they're trying to penetrate Hrodar's intelligence service. If they can get a few people in the right places in Boktor, they'll have access to most of the state secrets in the West. I see. Aunt Pole's voice was as cold as ice. I heard Grodeg talking once, Islena said in a tone of distaste. It was before he found out that I didn't want anything more to do with him. He'd been reading the auguries and the signs in the heavens, and he was talking about the return of the Raven King. The cult takes the term Overlord of the West quite seriously. I honestly believe that their ultimate goal is to elevate Belgarion to the status of Emperor of all the West. Aloria, Sendaria, Erendia, Tol'Nedra, and Nyssa. That's not how the term was meant to be interpreted, Aunt Pole objected. I know, Islena replied, but Grodeg wants to twist it until it comes out that way. He's a total fanatic, and he wants to convert all the people of the West to Belar, by the sword if necessary. That idiot!
Aunt Pole raged. He'd start a general war in the West if he tried that, and even set the gods to wrangling. What is there about Alorns that makes them continually want to expand to the south? Those boundaries were established by the gods themselves. I think it's time for someone to put his foot down on Grodeg's neck. Firmly. Go to Anheg immediately.
They're talking about Grodeg is Bear Cult, head priest of Belar. Grodeg. Not. I don't think there is a Rodig. There's King. What's his name? Rodar. There's King Rodar. Yeah, it's King Rodar. Alright, so. Go to Anheg immediately. Tell him everything, and then tell him that I want to see him. I imagine that my father's going to want to discuss the matter with him as well. Anheg's going to be furious with me, Polgara, Islena faltered. I don't think so, Aunt Pole assured her. As soon as he realizes that you've exposed Grodeg's plan, he'll probably be rather grateful. Let him think that you went along with Grodeg simply to get more information. That's a perfectly respectable motive. And it's the sort of thing a good wife would do. Any good wife would infiltrate a cult for the good of their nation. I hadn't thought of that, Islena said, already sounding more sure of herself. It would have been a brave thing to do, wouldn't it? Absolutely heroic, Islena, Aunt Pole replied. Now go to Anheg. It would have been a brave thing to do. I'm glad that I did that. Great job, past me. Spying is perfectly respectable. Yes. I will, Polgara. There was the sound of quick, determined steps, and then a door closed. Garion, come back in here. Aunt Pole's voice was firm. He opened the door. You were listening? It wasn't really a question. Well, we're going to have a talk about that, she told him, but it doesn't really matter this time. Go find your grandfather and tell him that I want to see him immediately. I don't care what he's doing. Bring him to me now. But how do we know he can do anything? Garion demanded. I mean, if he's lost his power... There are many kinds of power, Garion. Sorcery's only one of them. Now, go fetch him at once. Yes, Aunt Pole, Garion replied, already moving toward the door. Intrigue! I want it now! That's about what she sounded like, right? I'm going to go straight into chapter... Well, let's see how long chapter 16 is, but we're not even at 8 o'clock quite yet. It goes from page 145 to 156, so 11 pages. I'll get started on it, and if we decide we want to wrap up earlier, just, let me know if anyone needs to depart. I don't mind doing half a chapter if we need to. Chapter 16. The High Priest of Belar was an imposing-looking man, nearly 7 feet tall. He had a long, gray beard and burning eyes sunk deep in their sockets beneath bristling black eyebrows. Sure, he probably doesn't have all the habits of Rasputin, but for some reason that's what's coming to mind from that initial description. He arrived from Val Elorn the following week, after the seemingly endless negotiations had finally produced the official betrothal document. Accompanying him as a kind of retinue were 24 hard-faced warriors dressed in bearskins.
Bear cultists,
Barak observed sourly to Garion and Silk, as the 3 of them stood atop the wall of the citadel, watching the high priest and his men mounting the steps from the harbor in the bright spring sunshine. I didn't say anything about bringing soldiers with him, Garion objected indignantly. I imagine he took it upon himself, Silk replied. Grodeg's very good at taking things upon himself. I wonder how he'd like it if I threw him into a dungeon, Garion said hotly. Do I have a dungeon? Wow, Garion. I mean, obviously Garion is already not liking Grodeg because of the previous scene, so he's got good reason to be upset. But just escalating things kind of quickly, isn't he?
We could improvise one, I suppose,
Barak grinned at him.
Some nice damp cellar someplace. You might have to import some rats, though. The island's reputed to be free of them.
It's a king's perk to have a dungeon. I don't know if I would match Leldoran up against the head of the bear cult. He's been out of the party for a while. He hasn't been getting experience points. This is a book from the 80s, so leveling up worked a bit differently back then, you know? You had to really earn those levels. Just for a light impaling. Good leg stabbing from a distance. Although I suppose the actual leg stabbing was probably from up close because it was a duel. The leg breaking was from a distance. Yeah. Alright. The island's reputed to be free of rats. You're making fun of me, Garion accused his friend, flushing slightly.
Now, you know I wouldn't do that, Garion,
Barak replied, pulling at his beard. It's not Belgarath. It's not scratching. I'd talk with Belgarath before I had Grodeg clapped in irons, though, Silk suggested. The political implications might go a bit further than you intend. Whatever you do, don't let Grodeg talk you into letting him leave any of his men behind. He's been trying to get a foothold on the Isle of the Winds for 20 years now. Not even Brand has had the nerve to let him go that far. Silk's just actually giving practical advice here. Brand? Isn't it obvious? I wouldn't want to say that Brand's a cult member, but his sympathies certainly lie in that direction. Garion was shocked at that, and a little sick. What do you think I ought to do? He asked.
Don't try to play politics with these people, Barak replied. Grodeg's here to conduct the official betrothal ceremony. Just let it go at that.
He'll try to talk to me, though, Garion fretted. I really wanted to make that whinier. It was really hard not to really wind that up. He'll try to talk to me, though, Garion fretted. He's going to try to make me lead an invasion into the southern kingdoms so that he can convert the Arans and Tolnedrans and Nissans to the worship of Belar. Where did you hear that? Silk asked curiously. Garion spilling the beans to one of the world's top spies. I'd rather not say, Garion evaded. Does Belgarath know? Garion nodded. Aunt Pole told him. Keeps offering up more information than he's asking. I mean, Silk's his friend, but... Silk chewed thoughtfully on a fingernail. This next line here is one of my favorite bits of advice from, like, the entire series. Just be stupid, he said finally. What? Pretend to be a simple country bumpkin with no idea of what's going on. Grodeg's going to do everything he can to get you alone so he can wring concessions out of you. Just keep smiling and nodding foolishly, and every time he makes a proposal, send for Belgarath. Let him think that you can't make a single decision on your own. Won't that make me seem... well, do you really care what he thinks? Well, not really, I guess, but...
It'll drive him crazy,
Barak pointed out with a wicked grin.
He'll think that you're a complete idiot, a ripe plum ready for picking. But he'll realize that if he wants you, he'll have to fight Belgarath to get you. He'll be tearing out his beard in frustration before he leaves.
He turned and looked admiringly at Silk.
That's really a terrible thing to do to a man like Grodeg, you know.
Silk smirked. Isn't it, though? The three of them stood grinning at each other and finally burst into laughter. The official betrothal ceremony was conducted the following day. There had been a great deal of haggling about who should enter the hall of the Raven King first, but that difficulty had been overcome by Belgarath's suggestion that Garion and Ce'Nedra could enter arm in arm.
This is all in preparation for a wedding, after all,
he pointed out.
We might as well start off with a semblance, at least, of friendship.
All right, so he does get the idea, at least. Garion was very nervous as the hour approached. His princess had been smoldering since the incident with the amulet, and he was almost certain that there was going to be trouble. It's so cute how he thinks of her as his princess, basically, ever since this all came out into the open. But, to his surprise, Ce'Nedra was radiant as the two of them waited alone together in a small antechamber while the official guests gathered in the hall. Garion fidgeted a great deal and walked up and down, nervously adjusting his clothing, but Ce'Nedra sat rather demurely, patiently awaiting the trumpet fanfare which was to announce their entrance. This sort of thing really is her purview, after all. "Garion," she said after a while. "Yes?" "Do you remember that time we bathed together in the Wood of the Dryads?" "We did not bathe together," Garion replied quickly, blushing to the roots of his hair. Tolnedrin, Sandarian turned Raven. "Well, very nearly." She brushed his distinction aside. "Do you realize that Lady Polgara kept throwing us together like that all the time we were traveling? She knew that all this was going to happen, didn't she?" "Yes," Garion admitted. Nice realization. "So she kept shoving us at each other, hoping something might happen between us." Garion thought about that. "You're probably right," he concluded. "She likes to arrange people's lives for them." Ce'Nedra sighed. "Look at all the opportunities we missed," she said, somewhat regretfully. "Ce'Nedra!" Garion gasped, shocked at her suggestion. She giggled a bit wickedly. Then she sighed again. "Now it's all going to be dreadfully official, and probably not nearly as much fun." Garion's face was flaming by now. "Anyway," she continued, "that time we bathed together. Do you remember that I asked you if you'd like to kiss me?" Garion nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "I never got that kiss, you know," she said archly, standing up and crossing the small room to him. "And I think I'd like it now." She took hold of the front of his doublet firmly with both little hands. Is it uncomfortable? I wonder. Let's find out. "You owe me a kiss, Belgarian of Riva, and a Tolnedrin always collects what people owe her." That's a good line. The look she directed up through her lashes at him smoldered dangerously. Just outside, the trumpets blared out an extended fanfare. Saved by the bell? "We're supposed to go in now," Garion sputtered a bit desperately. "Let them wait," she murmured, her arms sliding up around his neck. "Not saved by the bell." Garion tried for a quick, perfunctory kiss, but his princess had other ideas. Her little arms were surprisingly strong, and her fingers locked in his hair. The kiss was lingering, and Garion's knees began to tremble. "There," Ce'Nedra breathed when she finally released him. "We'd better go in," Garion suggested as the trumpets blared again. In a moment. Did you muss me? She turned around so that he could inspect her. No, he replied. Everything still seems to be in order. She shook her head rather disapprovingly. Try to do a little better next time, she told him. Otherwise, I might start to think that you're not taking me seriously. I'm never going to understand you, Ce'Nedra. I know, she said with a mysterious little smile. Then she patted his cheek gently. And I'm going to do everything I can to keep it that way. Shall we go in? We really shouldn't keep our guests waiting, you know. That's what I said in the first place. We were busy then, she declared with a certain grand indifference. Just a moment. She carefully smoothed his hair. There. That's better. Now give me your arm. Garion extended his arm, and his princess laid her hand on it. Then he opened the door to the third chorus from the trumpets. They entered the hall, and an excited buzz ran through the crowd assembled there. Taking his cue from Ce'Nedra, Garion moved at a stately pace, his face sober and regal-looking. Not quite so grim, she whispered. Ce'Nedra, have you been paying attention? Not so grim? That's like the key word of these books. Gotta get my money's worth out of that emote. Garion, you're being too barred, apparently. You're not. It's an engagement ceremony, that's fair. Not quite so grim, she whispered. Smile a little, and nod occasionally. It's the thing to do. This is something else she could give him lessons in. A third thing. If you say so, he replied. I really don't know too much about this sort of thing. You will be just fine, she assured him. Smiling and nodding to the spectators, the royal couple passed through the hall to the chair that had been placed near the front for the princess. Garion held the chair for her, then bowed and mounted the dais to his throne. As always happened, the orb of Aldur began to glow as soon as he sat down. This time, however, it seemed to have a faint pink cast to it. The official betrothal ceremony began with a rolling invocation delivered in a thunderous voice by the high priest of Belar. Grodeg took full advantage of the dramatics of the situation.
Tiresome old windbag, isn't he?
Belgarath murmured from his accustomed place at the right of the throne. What were you and Ce'Nedra doing in there? Aunt Pol asked Garion. Nothing, Garion replied, blushing furiously. Really? And it took you all that time? How extraordinary. Okay, yeah, I think we gotta stamp in the spot. I think that I couldn't put up an argument against it at this point. The Sharkies were right. Garion must stay in an uncomfortable situation. Oh boy. So we've got a lot of space or lines now that are 2 spots away. Marriage.
Marriage is what brings us here today.
How extraordinary. He might as well have lipstick marks on his face. He might. Grodeg had begun reading the first clauses of the betrothal agreement. To Garion, they sounded like pure gibberish. At various points, Grodeg stopped his reading to look sternly at Garion.
Does His Majesty, Belgarion of Riva, agree to this?
He demanded each time. I do, Garion replied.
Does Her Highness Ce'Nedra of the Tolnedran Empire agree to this?
Grodeg asked the princess. The voice I've chosen for him is making this the most ridiculous betrothal ceremony. Ce'Nedra responded in a clear voice, I do.
How are you two getting along?
Belgarath asked, ignoring the droning voice of the clergyman. Who knows? Garion answered helplessly. I can't tell from one minute to the next what she's going to do. That's the way it's supposed to be, Otpol told him. I don't suppose you'd consider explaining that. No, dear, she replied with a smile as mysterious as Ce'Nedra's had been. I didn't really think so, he grumbled. Garion thought about Ce'Nedra's rather open invitation to muss her during the interminable reading of the document, which was firmly nailing down the remainder of his life. And the more he thought about it, the more he found the notion of a bit of polite mussing attractive. That's so British. He rather hoped that the princess would linger after the ceremony, and that they might go someplace private to discuss it. Following Grodeg's pompous benediction, however, Ce'Nedra was immediately surrounded by all the younger girls in the court, and swept away for some private celebration of their own. From all the giggling and wicked little glances cast in his direction, he concluded that the conversation at their little get-together was going to be very frank, probably naughty, and the less he knew about it, the better. As Silk and Barak had predicted, the High Priest of Belar tried several times to speak to Garion privately. Each time, however, Garion put on a great show of ingenuousness and sent immediately for Belgarath. Grodeg left the island with his entire retinue the following day. To add a final insult to the whole matter, Garion insisted that he and Belgarath accompany the fuming ecclesiast to his ship to see him off, and to be certain that no bear cultist might inadvertently be left behind.
Whose idea was all of this?
Belgarath inquired as he and Garion climbed the steps back to the citadel. Silk and I worked it out, Garion replied smugly.
I might have known.
Smugness isn't the same as cockiness. I thought things went quite well, Garion congratulated himself.
You've made yourself a dangerous enemy, you know.
We can handle him.
You're getting to be very free with that we, Garion,
Belgarath said disapprovingly. We're all in this together, aren't we, grandfather? Belgarath looked at him helplessly for a moment, and then began to laugh. Belgarath's not used to people using him. In the days that followed Grodeg's departure, however, there was little occasion for laughter. Once the official ceremonies were over, the Alorn kings, King Fulrak, and various advisors and generals got down to business. Their subject was war. The most recent reports I have from Cthul Murgos indicate that Tar Urgas is preparing to move the southern Murgos up from Rakhaga as soon as the weather breaks on the eastern coast, King Rodar advised them.
And the Nadraks?
King Anheg asked. They appear to be mobilizing. That's what my obviously was. They appear to be mobilizing, but there's always a question about the Nadraks. They play their own game, so it takes a lot of Grolims to whip them into line. The Thulls just obey orders. The Thulls don't really concern anyone, Brand observed. The key to the whole situation is how many Malorians are going to be able to take the field against us. Malorians are interesting. We've heard of Malorians a few times. Are there any specific Malorians that we've actually encountered? Because Murgos are the ones with the scarred cheeks, and Grolims are usually mistaken for Murgos, right? And Grolims are like the secret priests, like the secret sorcerers among the Murgos, I think. We've encountered one Nadrak, which was that guy that like offered to buy Aunt Pole, but like invited them into his tent, shared a drink with them, and then they were brothers until the sunrise. He seemed like a decent guy. We've at least heard a fair amount about Thullish society. We've maybe seen a Thull or two. We saw one Thull throw himself off a cliff. And I'm pretty sure we've seen a few Thulls being sacrificed. But I don't know if we've actually encountered any Malorians. And, like, I feel like the only times we've heard of Malorians is just sort of as this mysterious background group. So, the key to the whole situation is how many Malorians are going to be able to take the field against us. There's a staging area for them being set up at Thul Zelik. First time we've heard of Thul Zelik, I think, Rodar reported. But they're also waiting for the weather to break in the Sea of the East. King Anheg frowned thoughtfully.
Malorians are bad sailors, he mused. They won't move until summer, and they'll hug the north coast all the way to Thul Zelik. We need to get a fleet into the Sea of the East as soon as possible. If we can sink enough of their ships and drown enough of their soldiers, we might be able to keep them out of the war entirely. I think we should strike in force into Gar Og Nadrak. Once we get into the forests, my men can build ships. We'll sail down the river Cordu and out into the Sea of the East.
was some good bed prep there, Ben. That was really cute. Now he's got his chin hanging over the edge. Thy plan hath merit, your majesty, Mandaralin approved, studying the large map hanging on the wall. The Nadraks are fewest in number and farthest removed from the hordes of southern Thulmurgos. King Rodar shook his head stubbornly. I know you want to get to the sea as quickly as possible, Anheg, he objected, but you're committing me to a campaign in the Nadrak forest. I need open country to maneuver in. If we strike at the Thuls, we can cut directly across to the upper reaches of the River Mardu, and you can sail on down to the sea that way. There aren't that many trees in Mishrak Ak Thul, Anheg protested. His gravel digging is a little different, though, because he does this. He gets in there and he puts his paws sideways and he, like, clears the gravel away so he can get to the dirt. Like a little mole. There aren't that many trees in Mishrak Ak Thul, Anheg protested. Why build ships out of green lumber if you don't have to? Rodar asked. Why not sail up the Aldur and then portage across? You want my men to portage ships up the eastern escarpment? Rodar, be serious. We have engineers, Anheg. They can devise ways to lift your ships to the top of the escarpment. Garion did not want to intrude his inexperience on the conference, but the question came out before he had time to think about it. Have we decided where the final battle's going to be? He asked. Which final battle was that, Garion? Rodar asked politely. When we meet them head-on, like Vomimbre. There won't be a Vomimbre in this war, Anheg told him. Not if we can help it. Vomimbre was a mistake, Garion, Belgarath said quietly. We all knew it, but there wasn't anything we could do about it. We won, didn't we? The, iron rings. We won, didn't we? That was pure luck, and you can't plan a campaign on the hope that you might get lucky. Nobody wanted the battle at Vomimbre. We didn't, and Kaltorak didn't, but nobody had any choice in the matter. We had to commit to battle before the second Angarak column arrived in the west. Kaltorak had been holding the southern Murgos and eastern Malorians in reserve near Rakhaga, and they started to march when he turned west from the siege of the stronghold. If they'd been able to join forces with Kaltorak, there wouldn't have been enough men in all the west to meet them, so we had to fight. Vomimbre was the least objectionable battlefield. Why didn't Kaltorak just wait until they arrived? Garion asked. You can't stop an army in unfriendly territory, King Belgarion, Colonel Brendig explained. I don't remember his voice, so now he's kind of British-ish. You have to keep moving, or the local populace destroys all the food and starts coming out at night to cut up your people. You can lose half your army that way. Kaltorak didn't want the meeting at Vomimbre any more than we did, Belgarath went on. The column from Rakhaga got caught in a spring blizzard in the mountains and bogged down for weeks.
They finally had to turn back, and Torak was forced to fight at Vomimbre without any advantage of numbers, and nobody in his right mind goes into battle that way.
Thy force should be larger by a quarter than thine adversaries, Mandaralin agreed, or else the outcome must be in doubt.
By a third,
Barak corrected in a rumbling voice.
By half, if you can arrange it.
Then all we're going to do is spread out all over the eastern half of the continent and fight a whole series of little battles, Garion demanded incredulously. That could take years, decades. It could go on for a century.
If it has to,
Belgarath told him bluntly.
What did you expect, Garion? A short little ride in the sunshine, a nice easy fight, and then home before winter? I'm afraid it won't be like that. You'd better get used to wearing armor and a sword, because you'll probably be dressed that way for most of the rest of your life. This is likely to be a very long war.
Garion's illusions were crumbling rapidly. The door to the council room opened then, and Olban, Bran's youngest son, entered and spoke with his father. Olban. The weather had turned blustery, and a spring storm was raking the island. Olban's grey Revan cloak was dripping as he entered. Dismayed by the prospect of year after year of campaigning in the east, Garion distractedly stared at the puddle forming around Olban's feet as the young man talked quietly with Brand. Then, out of habit, he lifted his eyes slightly to look at the hem of Olban's cloak. There was a small tear on the left corner of the cloak, and a scrap of cloth seemed to be missing. Garion stared at the telltale rip for a moment, without realizing exactly what it was he saw. Then he went suddenly cold. With a slight start, he jerked his eyes up to look at Olban's face. Brand's youngest son was perhaps Garion's own age, a bit shorter, but more muscular. His hair was pale blonde, and his young face was serious, reflecting already the customary Revan gravity. He seemed to be trying to avoid Garion's eyes, but showed no other sign of nervousness. Once, however, he looked inadvertently at the young king and seemed to flinch slightly, as guilt rose clearly into his eyes. Garion had found the man who had tried to kill him. The conference continued after that, but Garion did not hear any more of it. What was he to do? Had Olban acted alone, or were others involved? Had Brand himself been a part of it? It was so difficult to know what a Revan was thinking. He trusted Brand, but the big warder's connection with the bear cult gave a certain ambiguity to his loyalties. Could Grodeg be behind all this? Or perhaps a Grolim? Garion remembered the Earl of Yarvik, whose soul had been purchased by Asherak, and who had mounted a rebellion in Val Alorn. Had Olban fallen perhaps under the spell of the blood-red gold of Angarak, as Yarvik had? But Riva was an island, the one place in the world where no Grolim could ever come. Garion discounted the possibility of bribery. In the first place, it was not in the Revan character. In the second, Olban had not likely ever been in a situation to come into contact with a Grolim. Rather grimly, Garion decided on a course of action. Leldorin, of course, had to be kept out of it. The hot-headed young Asturian was incapable of the kind of delicate discretion that seemed to be called for. Leldorin would reach for his sword, and the whole business would disintegrate rather rapidly after that.
When the conference broke up for the day late that afternoon, Garion went looking for Olban. He did not take a guard with him, but he did wear his sword. As chance had it, it was in a dim corridor not unlike the one where the assassination attempt had taken place that the young king finally ran Bran's youngest son down. Olban was coming along the passageway in one direction, and Garion was going the other. Olban's face paled slightly when he saw his king, and he bowed deeply to hide his expression. Garion nodded as if intending to pass without speaking, but turned after the two of them had gone by each other. "Olban," he said quietly. Bran's son turned, a look of dread on his face. "I noticed that the corner of your cloak is torn," Garion said in an almost neutral tone. When you take it to have it mended, this might help." He took the scrap of cloth out from under his doublet and offered it to the pale-faced young Revan. Olban stared wide-eyed at him, not moving. "As long as we're at it," Garion continued, "you might as well take this, too. I think you dropped it somewhere." He reached inside his doublet again and took out the dagger with its bent point. Olban started to tremble violently. Then he suddenly dropped to his knees. "Please, Your Majesty," he begged, "let me kill myself. If my father finds out what I've done, it will break his heart." "Why did you try to kill me, Olban?" Garion asked. "For love of my father," Bran's son confessed, tears welling up in his eyes. "He was ruler here in Riva until you came. Your arrival degraded him. I couldn't bear that. Please, Your Majesty, don't have me dragged to the scaffold like a common criminal. Give me the dagger, and I'll bury it in my heart right here. Spare my father this last humiliation." "Don't talk nonsense," Garion told him. "And get up. You look silly down there on your knees." "Your Majesty," Olban began to protest. "Oh, be still," Garion told him irritably. "Let me think for a moment." Dimly, he began to see the glimmer of an idea. "All right," he said finally. "This is what we're going to do. You're going to take this knife and this wool scrap down to the harbor and throw them into the sea. And then you're going to go on about your life as if this had never happened." "Your Majesty," "I'm not finished. Neither you nor I will ever speak of this again. I don't want any hysterical public confessions, and I absolutely forbid you to kill yourself. Do you understand me, Olban?" Dumbly, the young man nodded. "I need your father's help too much to have this come out, or for him to be distracted by personal tragedy. This did not happen, and that's an end of it. Take these and get out of my sight." He shoved the knife and the wool scrap into Olban's hands. He was suddenly infuriated. The weeks of looking nervously over his shoulder had all been so unnecessary, so useless. "Oh, one other thing, Olban," he added as the stricken young Revan turned to leave. "Don't throw any more knives at me. If you want to fight, let me know, and we'll go someplace private and cut each other to ribbons if that's what you want." Olban fled, sobbing. "Very well done, Belgarion," the dry voice complimented him. "Oh, shut up," Garion said. I feel like in scenes like this, you can catch glimpses of both Belgarath and Aunt Pole coming out in Garion. The way they act when they're annoyed. It hasn't happened with Garion very frequently because he hasn't really been in like a position of authority, to openly act irritated with other people. He hasn't really been on equal footing even. But when it does come up, like, I feel like you can see his upbringing a little bit. Let's see. We've only got a couple more pages to go. A few more. He slept very little that night. He had a few doubts about the wisdom of the course he had taken with Olban, but on the whole he was satisfied that what he had done had been right. Olban's act had been no more than an impulsive attempt to erase, it was very premeditated, it seems like, to erase what he believed to be his father's degradation. There had been no plot involved in it. Olban might resent Garion's magnanimous gesture, but he would not throw any more daggers at his king's back. What disturbed Garion's sleep the most during that restless night was Belgarath's bleak appraisal of the war upon which they were about to embark. He slept briefly on toward dawn, and awoke from a dreadful nightmare with icy sweat standing out on his forehead. He had just seen himself, old and weary, leading a pitifully small army of ragged, gray-haired men into a battle they could not possibly win. There's an alternative, of course, if you've recovered enough from your bout of peevishness to listen. The voice in his mind advised him as he sat bolt upright and trembling in his bed. "What?" Garion answered aloud. "Oh, that. I'm sorry I spoke that way. I was irritated, that's all." "In many ways, you're like Belgarath. Remarkably so. This irritability seems to be hereditary." "It's only natural, I suppose," Garion conceded. "You said there was an alternative. An alternative to what?" "To this war that's giving you nightmares. Get dressed. I want to show you something." Garion climbed out of his bed and hastily jerked on his clothing. "Where are we going?" he asked, still speaking aloud. "It isn't far." The room to which the other awareness directed him was musty and showed little evidence of use, so he's not taking him to the throne room. The books and scrolls lining the shelves along its walls were dust-covered, and cobwebs draped the corners. Garion's lone candle cast looming shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. "On the top shelf," the voice told him. "The scroll wrapped in yellow linen. Take it down." Garion climbed up on a chair and took down the scroll. "What is this?" he asked. "The Mrin Codex. I believe we've seen mention of that before." "Take off the cover and start unrolling it. I'll tell you when to stop." It took Garion a moment or two to get the knack of unrolling the bottom of the scroll with one hand and rolling up the top with the other. "There," the voice said. "That's the passage. Read it." Garion struggled over the words. The script was spidery, and he still did not read very well. "It doesn't make any sense," he complained. "The man who wrote it down was insane," the voice apologized. "And he was an imbecile besides. But he was all I had to work with. Try it again, out loud." Garion read, "Behold, it shall come to pass that in a certain moment that which must be and that which must not be shall meet, and in that meeting shall be decided all that has gone before and all that will come after. Then will the child of light and the child of dark face each other in the broken tomb, and the stars will shudder and grow dim." Garion's voice trailed off. "It still doesn't make any sense," he objected. It's a bit obscure. It doesn't seem that obscure to me, huh? Makes sense. It's a bit obscure, the voice admitted. As I said, the man who wrote it was insane. I put the ideas there, but he used his own words to express them. Who is the child of light? Garion asked. You are. For the moment, at least. It changes. Me? Of course. Then who's this child of dark I'm supposed to meet? Torak. Torak? I should have thought that would be obvious by now. I told you once about the two possible destinies coming together finally. You and Torak, the child of light and the child of dark, embody those destinies. But Torak's asleep. Not anymore. When you first put your hand on the orb, the touch signaled his awakening. Even now he stirs on the edge of awareness, and his hand fumbles for the hilt of K'threk Goru, his black sword. Garion went very cold. Are you saying that I'm supposed to fight Torak? Alone? It's going to happen, Belgarion. The universe itself rushes toward it. You can gather an army if you want, but your army, or Torak's, won't mean anything. As the Codex says, everything will be decided when you finally meet him. In the end, you'll face each other alone. That's what I meant by an alternative. What you're trying to say is that I'm just supposed to go off alone and find him and fight him? Garion demanded incredulously. Approximately, yes. I won't do it. That's up to you. Garion struggled with it. If I take an army, I'll just get a lot of people killed, and it won't make any difference in the end anyway. Not the least bit. In the end, it will just be you, Torak, K'threk Goru, K'threk, C-T-H-R-E-K, K'threk Goru, and the Sword of the Revan King. Don't I have any choice at all? None whatsoever. Do I have to go alone? Garion asked plaintively. It doesn't say that. Could I take one or two people with me? That's your decision, Belgarion. Just don't forget to take your sword. He thought about it for the rest of the day. In the end, his choice was obvious. As evening settled over the grey city of Riva, he sent for Belgarath and Silk. There were some problems involved, he knew. There was no one else he could rely on. Even if his power were diminished, Belgarath's wisdom made Garion not even want to consider the undertaking without him. And Silk, of course, was just as essential. Garion reasoned that his own increasing talent for sorcery could see them through any difficulties if Belgarath should falter, and Silk could probably find ways to avoid most of the serious confrontations. Garion was confident that the three of them would be able to cope with whatever arose, until they found Torak. He didn't want to think about what might happen then. When the two of them arrived, the young king was staring out the window with haunted eyes. You sent for us? Silk asked. I have to make a journey, Garion replied in a scarcely audible voice.
What's bothering you? Belgarath said. You look a bit sick.
I just found out what it is that I'm supposed to do, Grandfather.
Who told you?
He did. Belgarath pursed his lips.
A bit premature, perhaps, he suggested. I was going to wait a while longer, but I have to assume he knows what he's doing.
Who is this we're talking about? Silk asked.
Garion has a periodic visitor, the old man answered. A rather special visitor.
That's a singularly unenlightening response, old friend.
Are you sure you really want to know?
Yes, Silk replied. I think I do. I get the feeling that I'm going to be involved in it. Link to the Past is still up there among my favorites. I do really like both Skyward Sword and what was the one before Skyward Sword? Twilight Princess. I do like both of them a lot. I think those are my top three: Link to the Past, Skyward Sword, and Twilight Princess. Excuse me. Alright. I get the feeling that I'm going to be involved in it.
You're aware of the prophecy?
Naturally.
It appears that the prophecy is a bit more than a statement about the future. It seems to be able to take a hand in things from time to time. It speaks to Garion on occasion.
Silk's eyes narrowed as he thought about that. All right, he said finally.
You don't seem surprised.
The rat-faced little man laughed. Belgarath, nothing about this whole thing surprises me anymore. Belgarath turned back to Garion.
Exactly what did he tell you?
He showed me the Mrin Codex. Have you ever read it?
From end to end and backward and forward, even from side to side a couple of times. Which part did he show you?
The part about the meeting of the Child of Light and the Child of Dark.
Oh,
Belgarath said.
I was afraid it might have been that part. Did he explain it?
Dumbly, Garion nodded.
Well,
the old man said with a penetrating look.
Now you know the worst. What are you going to do about it?
He gave me a couple of alternatives, Garion said. I can wait until we get an army together, and we can go off and fight back and forth with the Angaraks for generations. That's one way, isn't it? Belgarath nodded. Of course, that will get millions of people killed for nothing, won't it? The old man nodded again. Garion drew in a deep breath. Or, he continued, I can go off by myself and find Torak, wherever he is, and try to kill him. Silk whistled, his eyes widening. He said that I didn't have to go alone, Garion added hopefully. I asked him about that.
Thanks,
Belgarath said dryly. Silk sprawled in a nearby chair, rubbing thoughtfully at his pointed nose. He looked at Belgarath. You know that Pulgara would skin the both of us inch by inch if we let him go off alone, don't you? Belgarath grunted. Where did you say Torak is?
Cthul Mishrak, in Meloria.
I've never been there.
I have, a few times. It's not a very attractive place.
Maybe time has improved it.
That's not very likely.
Silk shrugged. Maybe we ought to go with him. Show him the way, that sort of thing. It's time I left Riva anyway. Some ugly rumors are starting to go around about me.
It is rather a good time of year for traveling,
Belgarath admitted, giving Garion a sly, sidelong glance. Garion felt better already. He knew from their bantering tone that they had already made up their minds. He would not have to go in search of Torak alone. For now, that was enough. There'd be time for worrying later. All right, he said. What do we do?
We creep out of Riva very quietly, Belgarath replied. There's nothing to be gained by getting into any long discussions with your Aunt Pole about this.
The wisdom of ages, Silk agreed fervently. When do we start? His ferret eyes were very bright.
The sooner the better,
Belgarath shrugged.
Did you have any plans for tonight?
Nothing I can't postpone.
All right, then. We'll wait until everyone goes to bed, and then we'll pick up Garion's sword and get started.
Which way do we go first? Garion asked him.
Sendaria first,
Belgarath replied.
And then across Drasnia to Garog Nadrak. Then north to the archipelago that leads to Meloria. It's a long way to Cthul Mishrak and the tomb of the one-eyed god.
And then?
Then, Garion, we settle this once and for all.
Just about 2 hours there. Dun, dun, dun. It was an interesting chapter. They started to set up this big war, this huge campaign. They talked some interesting strategic plans. Like, I think the most sort of like tactical strategic talk we've had in the entire series about how they were going to mount their campaign. And then they go, or instead of that, we split the party and we get this back onto being a D&D campaign. Don't split the party. Sometimes, depending on the system and the game, I argue that splitting the party is a good idea. I know common conventional wisdom is don't do that, and especially in D&D, for the most part I'd argue that that's the case, unless you've got, the sneaky side of the party needs to do some sneaking without heavy armor clanking behind them. But in some settings and in some game types, it's important to do that occasionally. Well, there's very different types of games. It has very, very rarely gone well in your experience. It depends on the game. Depends on the game and the system too. If it's just a Monty Hall, kick down the door, kill some monsters, get some loot, then you don't really need to split the party. Well, it is important to split the party correctly, which our group notoriously has not done in the past, at least a few times. All right, well. So I'll see some of you tomorrow, hopefully. And Coquitlam Center around noon, possibly on the northern side of the mall, but I'm not certain. I'll try to send you a message if I find out whereabouts we're going to be ahead of time. Yeah. That's about it for me tonight.
I'm gonna go have a little something to eat, maybe go have a bath, and then get some sleep. A certain phalangeal bargain? Wow. Alright. Have a good weekend, everybody. Hopefully I'll see some of you tomorrow, and then I'll see everybody else next Wednesday. Next Wednesday is the 25th. I can't think of any reason off the top of my head that I won't be here. So have a good night. Have a good weekend. Bye.